are sailing from Ensenada to our next...
Picture this. It's 1977. America is still recovering from Watergate, Vietnam, and an oil crisis that left people sitting in gas lines for hours. The country needed an escape. And what did ABC give them? A cruise ship, a smiling captain, and 3 interlocking romance plots per episode. Critics called it the shallowest show on television. Audiences made it one of the longest-running hits of the entire decade. Somebody was right, and it wasn't the critics. The Love Boat ran for 10 seasons, generated 249 episodes, and welcomed virtually every recognizable face in Hollywood through its gangway at one point or another. But underneath the deck parties and the sunsets and Jack Tripper— sorry, wrong show. Underneath all that cheerful escapism was a production story that is considerably stranger, more turbulent, and more culturally significant than the show's reputation suggests. 15 facts. 15 stories. And by the time we get to number 1, you're going to understand why a show about people falling in love on a cruise ship was doing something that almost no other program on American television was willing to do. Let's set sail. 15. The show was based on a book nobody remembers before. The Love Boat was a television institution. It was a paperback. Geraldine Saunders, a former cruise director who had worked aboard actual cruise ships, wrote a memoir called The Love Boats, published in 1974, in which she recounted her experiences managing the social lives of passengers at sea. The book was breezy, anecdotal, and built around the central observation that cruise ships created a uniquely compressed social environment where romance, drama, and human comedy tended to accelerate. Saunders's insight was essentially sociological. Remove people from their ordinary lives. Place them in a contained environment with nothing to do but eat, relax, and interact with strangers. Add tropical scenery and unlimited cocktails. What you get, she argued, is human nature operating at an accelerated pace. People who might take years to decide whether they're in love make that decision in a week at sea. People who would never approach a stranger at home find the courage to do it on a Lido deck. Producer Aaron Spelling recognized that this premise, this specific social compression, was exactly what episodic television needed. Each voyage was a natural story container. New passengers every week meant new characters, new conflicts, new resolutions. The ship itself was a permanent setting that never needed to be re-established. And Saunders's core observation about accelerated human behavior gave the show its emotional engine. Saunders received a creator credit and a portion of the show's proceeds. Her book never became a bestseller. The television show based on it ran for a decade and made her observation about cruise ship romance one of the most widely distributed ideas in American popular culture of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The woman who noticed something about people on boats changed Saturday night television. Most people have never heard her name. 14. Aaron Spelling almost didn't make it. By the time The Love Boat went into production, Aaron Spelling was already one of the most successful television producers in Hollywood. The Mod Squad, Charlie's Angels, SWAT, Starsky and Hutch, his production company had an extraordinary record of commercial hits. He understood popular entertainment the way a master chef understands flavor. But The Love Boat almost didn't happen. And the reason it did is a story about persistence in the face of institutional skepticism. ABC had actually produced 2 Love Boat pilot television movies before the series was greenlit, one in 1976 and another shortly after. The pilots performed adequately, but not spectacularly. The network was uncertain. The concept was unusual. A show with an entirely rotating guest cast, anchored by a small, regular ensemble, set entirely on a cruise ship. It didn't fit the standard templates that network executives use to evaluate risk. Spelling believed in the concept with unusual conviction. He argued that the rotating guest cast was not a weakness, but a strength, that the ability to bring in recognizable faces week after week would create a different kind of audience engagement, something closer to an event than a standard drama. Every week was a premiere, in a sense, because every week brought new stars. He was right, and the numbers eventually proved it. But the path from 2 underwhelming pilots to a decade-long run required Spelling to push against institutional resistance that would have stopped most producers. The persistence wasn't stubbornness. It was a very clear-eyed reading of what the show could become if given the chance to find its audience. The Love Boat ran because Aaron Spelling wouldn't take a lukewarm maybe for an answer. 13. The ship was real, and Princess Cruises got a deal they couldn't have bought. The Pacific Princess, the ship that served as the love boat throughout the series, was a real operational cruise vessel belonging to Princess Cruises. It was not a set. It was not a mock-up. Actual passengers booked actual cruises on a ship that was simultaneously functioning as a television production location, with cameras, crew, and Hollywood actors sharing deck space with civilians who had simply wanted a holiday. The arrangement between the production and Princess Cruises was, from the cruise line's perspective, one of the most valuable promotional partnerships in the history of the industry. The company provided access to the ship, logistical support, and the authentic maritime environment that gave the show its credibility. In return, Princess Cruises received something that no advertising budget could have purchased: 10 years of weekly primetime exposure to tens of millions of viewers, with their brand embedded in a show that was, week after week, making the case that cruise ships were the most romantic and exciting vacation option available. Before the Love Boat, cruise holidays were considered a relatively niche product, associated primarily with older, wealthier travelers. After a decade of the show, the cruise industry experienced a transformation in public perception that industry analysts have directly connected to the show's influence. Younger audiences, middle-income families, people who had never considered a cruise as a realistic or appealing option began booking voyages. The cruise industry grew significantly through the late 1970s and 1980s, and Princess Cruises grew with it, and then some. The partnership between a television producer and a cruise line accidentally became one of the most effective long-form marketing campaigns in American commercial history. Neither party fully planned it that way. It happened because the show was genuinely persuasive about the experience it depicted. 12. The regular cast was chosen with unusual precision. The core ensemble of The Love Boat, Captain Stubing, Doc Bricker, Julie the cruise director, Gopher, Isaac the bartender, was not assembled casually. Each character occupied a specific social function on the ship, and each function corresponded to a specific type of interaction with the guest passengers. This was intentional architecture, designed to ensure that any guest character could plausibly interact with any regular character without it feeling forced. Captain Stubing, played by Gavin MacLeod, provided authority and gentle wisdom. Doc Bricker was comic relief with medical credibility. Julie McCoy was emotional access, the character who was closest to the passengers, who facilitated their stories, who gave them permission to open up. Isaac the bartender was the social hub, the character everyone passed through, the one who heard everyone's troubles in the classic tradition of the bartender as confessor. Gopher was utility, young, eager, slightly hapless, useful for physical comedy and romantic subplot. MacLeod had come off the Mary Tyler Moore Show, where he had played the vain and somewhat pompous Ted Baxter. Casting him as the dignified, warm-hearted Captain Stubing was a deliberate repositioning that demonstrated genuine range, and it worked so completely that most viewers who encountered him first as Captain Stubing were genuinely surprised to learn he'd built his career playing someone so thoroughly unlike that character. The ensemble functioned because it had been thought through structurally rather than assembled by feel. Each piece served the machine. And the machine, once assembled, proved remarkably durable. 11. The guest roster was the most ambitious in television history. Here is the statistic that stops people when they hear it clearly. Over the course of its 10-season run, The Love Boat featured approximately 1,000 guest stars. 1,000. Individual performers who appeared in episodes across the show's history, drawn from virtually every category of Hollywood fame available. The guest list reads like a fever dream of American celebrity. Ethel Merman, Andy Warhol, Milton Berle, Sid Charisse, Engelbert Humperdinck, Janet Jackson, Tom Hanks in an early television appearance, Florence Henderson, Bob Hope, Carol Channing, Gene Kelly, Pearl Bailey, Red Fox, Don Rickles, Dionne Warwick. The range of fame, age, genre, and decade represented across those 1,000 appearances is genuinely staggering. But here's where the guest roster becomes something more interesting than a trivia answer. The Love Boat functioned for many older performers as a career resuscitation mechanism. Stars whose film careers had wound down, performers from the golden age of Hollywood who were no longer being cast in leading roles, entertainers who had dominated their fields in the 1950s and early 1960s and found the 1970s less welcoming. The show offered them something invaluable. It offered them visibility. A primetime audience that recognized them, was delighted to see them, and gave them the chance to demonstrate that they still had it. For some of these performers, the Love Boat appearance was their first significant television exposure in years. The show understood, perhaps better than any other program of its era, that nostalgia is not a passive emotion, it's an active market. And it served that market with a generosity that the performers involved never forgot. 10. The show tackled topics nobody expected it to. This is the fact that consistently surprises people who think they know what the Love Boat was. Between the romance plots and the comedy subplots and the tropical backdrops, the show quietly and consistently engaged with subject matter that serious dramas of the era were reluctant to touch. Alcoholism, disability, terminal illness, aging and mortality, racial prejudice, the challenges faced by veterans returning from Vietnam, divorce and its impact on children, mental health and the social stigma surrounding it. These subjects appeared in The Love Boat not as sensationalism, but as the genuine human baggage that passengers brought aboard, the real weight underneath the vacation. The show's format actually made this easier rather than harder. Because the guest characters were new every week and their stories resolved within a single episode, the show could approach a subject, explore it with some honesty, and conclude it without the ongoing narrative commitment that a serial drama would require. The self-contained episode structure was not just a production convenience, it was a therapeutic architecture. Problems could be faced and resolved in 48 minutes, in the context of a beautiful setting, with characters who were fundamentally decent and supportive. This was, in its way, enormously comforting to audiences dealing with their own versions of those problems. The show wasn't telling viewers that difficult things were easy. It was telling them that difficult things were survivable, that even alcoholism, even grief, even loneliness could be faced, and that the facing of them, on a ship in the sun, might be the beginning of something better. That's not a trivial message. It just came dressed in a Hawaiian shirt. 9. The theme song almost ruined everything. Jack Jones recorded the original Love Boat theme, the version that played over the first pilot and early episodes. It was pleasant, it was professional, it was completely and totally forgettable. And when the show moved to series production, the producers recognized that forgettable was exactly what they could not afford. A television theme in the late 1970s was not merely an introduction. It was a piece of auditory branding that needed to immediately convey the emotional promise of the show to anyone hearing it from another room, any viewer whose attention was wandering, any casual browser of the dial who landed on the channel mid-song. The theme needed to work as advertising, as emotional preparation, and as a piece of music that people might find themselves humming on Tuesday when they'd heard it on Saturday night. The solution was a new version, recorded by Jack Jones, but with significant changes to the arrangement and production. And later, the version that became truly iconic was performed in a way that leaned into the specific warm, orchestral, slightly romantic register that the show was promising its audience. The melody, the lush strings, the invitation implicit in "Come aboard, we're expecting you," these were not accidental choices. They were precise calibrations of what Saturday night escapism was supposed to feel like before the first image appeared on screen. The Love Boat theme became one of the most recognized television themes in American broadcasting history. You can hum it right now without effort, decades after you last heard it in context. That's not luck. That's the result of understanding what a piece of music needs to do beyond simply being a piece of music. And if this kind of story, the machinery behind the magic, is what brings you back to this channel, hit subscribe. There are dozens more where this came from. 8. Gavin MacLeod's personal life mirrored the show. In an extraordinary way, Gavin MacLeod played Captain Merrill Steubing for 10 years, a character defined by warmth, romantic optimism, and the belief that love could be found and nurtured in even the most unexpected circumstances. The irony is that during a significant portion of that run, MacLeod's own marriage was falling apart. MacLeod and his wife Patty divorced during the show's run. He remarried, That marriage also ended. The man who spent a decade presiding over other people's fictional romances, who delivered lines about love and commitment and second chances week after week, was living through the painful real-world version of exactly those questions. The twist is where this becomes something other than merely ironic. MacLeod and his first wife Patty eventually reconciled. They remarried in 1985, toward the end of the show's run, and their reconciliation became a genuine public story, partly because MacLeod spoke about it openly, crediting faith and personal reflection for the reunion. The reconciliation was real, not a publicity arrangement, and it occurred in the context of a decade spent exploring, on screen, the possibility that love deserved second chances and that people could change. Whether the show influenced the life or the life informed the performance is not a question anyone can answer definitively. What's clear is that MacLeod brought something to Captain Stubing that went beyond professional competence. He brought the lived weight of someone who actually understood that love was difficult, impermanent, and worth fighting for. And that weight, invisible to audiences, was part of what made the character feel genuine. 7. The show changed how Hollywood thought about older performers. Before The Love Boat, the dominant assumption in Hollywood casting was that stars had a commercial lifespan. Younger audiences, the theory went, wanted younger performers. Nostalgia was a limited market. Booking a star from the 1950s for a significant role in a contemporary television show was a risk that most productions weren't willing to take on a regular basis. The Love Boat systematically and repeatedly demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. Week after week, the show brought in performers who were in their 60s and 70s, performers whose primary fame dated from decades earlier, and the ratings didn't suffer. They were often enhanced. The audience that watched The Love Boat skewed older than many network programs, and that audience responded to the presence of performers they had admired for decades with something closer to joy than nostalgia. The lesson was not lost on the industry. The show's success created a template for how older performers could be integrated into contemporary programming in ways that generated audience warmth rather than confusion. It suggested that the viewing public was capable of holding multiple generational reference points simultaneously, that an audience could appreciate both a young guest star and a legend from 30 years earlier appearing in the same episode, and find value in both. This shift in perception contributed to a gradual broadening of how television thought about the age range of its talent. The Love Boat model, the prestige of a legendary guest, the accessibility of a contemporary one, the mix creating something that appealed across age groups, influenced programming decisions that shaped American television in the decade that followed. The ship carried a lot of people. The industry remembered what that looked like. 6. The writer's room had an unusual problem every week. Most television dramas build their plots around a core set of regular characters, the writers. Know who these people are, what they want, how they talk, what makes them funny or compelling. Crafting a story is largely a matter of putting familiar characters into new situations. The Love Boat writer's room operated under a fundamentally different constraint. Every week, they had to create 3 to 4 separate storylines featuring characters who did not yet exist. Guest characters who would be played by whoever had been booked for that episode, whose personalities had to be constructed from scratch, whose emotional journeys had to begin, develop, and resolve in 48 minutes of screen time, and whose stories had to interweave with each other and with the regular cast in a way that felt organic rather than mechanical. This was, by any measure, a demanding creative challenge. The writers developed a set of structural templates, certain story shapes that reliably worked within the format, and then varied the execution rather than the architecture. The reformed rake who finds genuine love, the couple whose marriage is failing and rediscovers connection at sea, the older person facing a life transition, the estranged relatives who reconcile during the voyage. These shapes recurred because they worked. The variation came from the specificity of character and situation layered onto the reliable framework. Over 249 episodes, maintaining that volume of original story while working within severe structural constraints, the writers produced an archive of human emotional experience That is, taken as a whole, considerably more ambitious than it's usually given credit for being. The templates were not laziness. They were the enabling conditions that made extraordinary volume possible. 5. The final season revealed the show's unexpected ambition. The mid-1980s, The Love Boat was aging in the ratings. The cultural moment that had made it essential Saturday night viewing had shifted. The show was still performing, but it wasn't the force it had been at its peak. Rather than simply running out the clock on a declining property, the producers made a decision that is still discussed as either brave or bizarre, depending on your perspective. They took the show on the road, literally. In its later seasons, The Love Boat began shooting episodes in international locations that departed significantly from the original Pacific route, the Mediterranean, Europe, the canals of China. The production went genuinely global, shooting on location in places that American network television rarely went, creating episodes that functioned partly as travelogues and partly as the familiar romantic drama the show had built its reputation on. This expansion was expensive. It was logistically complicated. It required the kind of international production infrastructure that most American television shows of the era didn't have. And it demonstrated something about the people behind the show that the comfortable, sun-drenched aesthetic tended to obscure. They were ambitious. They weren't content to repeat a formula that was working. They wanted to see what the show could become with a wider world to work with. The ratings didn't recover sufficiently to save the show. The Love Boat ended in 1986, but the final season's global ambition gave the show a valedictory energy that a simple continuation of the original format would not have had. They went out trying something new. On television, that's rarer than it should be. 4. The show was a safe harbor for performers in personal crisis. This is the detail that tends to land hardest when people hear it because it reframes the entire atmosphere of the show. The Love Boat was known within the industry as a production that was relatively welcoming to performers who were navigating difficult personal circumstances: addiction, career decline, health issues, the particular vulnerability that comes with fame receding. This wasn't entirely altruism on the production's part. Booking performers who were between prominent projects or managing personal challenges often meant securing recognizable talent at rates that a more straightforward booking would not have achieved. The economics and the human decency were not entirely separable. But the effect for many of the performers who came aboard during difficult periods was genuinely significant. The Love Boat set was described by various accounts as a professional environment, structured, pleasant, not given to the kind of internal politics and tension that more self-consciously prestigious productions sometimes generate. For someone who needed to be reminded that they could still do the work, that the craft was still there, that an audience would still respond, a week on the Pacific Princess could be restorative in ways that went beyond the paycheck. Several performers spoke publicly at various points in their careers about what a Love Boat appearance had meant to them at a particular moment. Not as a career turning point, necessarily, but as an affirmation, a reminder that they were still welcomed, still valued, still capable. The ship that rescued fictional characters from loneliness and heartbreak was, in an unscripted way, occasionally doing something similar for the real people playing those characters. 3. Isaac's character broke ground nobody noticed at the time. Ted Lang played Isaac Washington, the bartender aboard the Pacific Princess, for the show's entire run. Isaac was funny, warm, socially central, and consistently portrayed as competent and respected by every other character in the ensemble. He was, in other words, a black character on American primetime television in the late 1970s who existed without the qualifier of crisis or struggle that black characters on American primetime television so frequently carried at the time. Isaac's blackness was not the subject of his stories. It was not the source of his conflicts. He was not defined by racial tension, or by the need to navigate prejudice, or by any of the narrative frameworks that were typically applied to black characters when they appeared in predominantly white ensemble casts of the era. He was simply a character, a full participant in the show's social world, whose race was part of who he was without being the entirety of who he was. This was not as common as it should have been in 1977. The representation of black Americans on primetime network television was, to put it charitably, inconsistent in its depth and dignity. The shows that handled it best were celebrated specifically for doing so. The Love Boat didn't celebrate its handling of this. It simply did it, week after week, without fanfare. Ted Lang brought intelligence and genuine comedic timing to Isaac and made him one of the most consistently entertaining members of a strong ensemble. The normalcy of his presence, the unremarkable, uncontested dignity of his place in that world, was, in the context of 1977 American television, quietly radical. And quiet radicalism is often the most durable kind. 2. The show's formula was adopted by an entire industry. The structural DNA of The Love Boat: contained location, rotating guest cast, multiple interweaving storylines, resolution within a single episode, did not stay exclusive to one show on one network. It became a template. Fantasy Island, which premiered the same year as The Love Boat and aired immediately after it on Saturday nights, operated on almost identical structural principles. Aaron Spelling produced both. The pairing was deliberate. Two shows that used the same containment mechanism, the same guest star model, the same emotional resolution architecture, back-to-back on the same evening. The Saturday night block became a destination. Viewers who came for one stayed for the other. But the influence extended beyond Spelling's own productions. The idea that a show could be built around a location rather than a set of fixed characters, that the setting itself could be the star with human stories cycling through it, proved adaptable to contexts far beyond cruise ships and wish-granting islands. Hotel dramas, hospital procedurals, airport shows. The Love Boat model, in various modified forms, appears across decades of subsequent television in formats that don't always acknowledge or even recognize the lineage. The show that critics dismissed as lightweight entertainment had, embedded in its construction, a structural innovation that the industry found endlessly reusable. That's not the legacy most people associate with The Love Boat, but it's the one that has had the most lasting effect on how television gets made. 1. What The Love Boat was it really about? Here is the thing that the show was doing that nobody talked about at the time, that critics didn't recognize because they were too busy being dismissive, and that audiences felt without necessarily articulating. The Love Boat was about the possibility of change. Not dramatic, violent, crisis-driven change of the kind that prestige drama delivers. Quiet change, the kind that happens when you're removed from your ordinary life for a week, surrounded by strangers who don't know your history, and given permission to be a slightly different version of yourself than the one everyone at home has decided you are. Every passenger who came aboard the Pacific Princess was, in some way, stuck. Stuck in a failing marriage, or a lonely singlehood, or a grief they hadn't processed, or a regret they'd been carrying for years. The ship didn't perform miracles. It provided context. It provided the distance from ordinary life that made the stuck thing feel, briefly, unstuck. It provided the presence of other people, the bartender, the cruise director, the doctor, the captain, who were professionally and personally invested in the passengers' well-being. This is what cruise ships actually do for people, Geraldine Saunders had noticed in the early 1970s. The social compression accelerates what ordinary life slows down, and The Love Boat made that observation into a 10-year argument that change was possible, that love was available, that the person you wanted to be was accessible if the right conditions were created around you. That argument reached tens of millions of people every Saturday night for a decade. It reached them when they were tired from the week, when their own lives felt stuck or complicated or smaller than they'd hoped. And it said, in the gentlest possible way, that the ship was still sailing. There was room for them, and the weather ahead looked promising. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. And maybe that's why, 47 years later, people still hum that theme without even meaning to. The Love Boat was dismissed by critics and embraced by audiences at a scale that the critics never entirely reckoned with. It was built by a producer who understood entertainment as a form of generosity, crewed by performers who brought more to their roles than the material demanded, and anchored by a ship that became the most persuasive advertisement for an entire industry that has ever been made. Here's what it actually means. looked at from this distance. We live in an era of maximum television prestige, shows of extraordinary craft and moral complexity that demand full attention and reward it with genuine artistic achievement. That era is valuable. But it has produced, as a side effect, a kind of ambient contempt for entertainment that simply wants to make people feel good. Entertainment that asks nothing of the viewer except to be present, to be open, and to believe for 48 minutes that things can work out. The Love Boat did not demand your intellectual engagement. It asked only for your Saturday evening and your willingness to care, briefly and genuinely, about people you'd never see again. In return, it gave you a ship, a sunset, and the quiet suggestion that love, in its various forms, at various ages, in various states of repair, was still worth pursuing. That's not a small gift, especially on a Saturday night when you really needed one. What's your strongest memory of The Love Boat? And is there a guest appearance that has stayed with you across the decades? The comments are open. Come aboard.